From luxury mansions to a cold prison cell, what really happened in Diddy's first 24 hours behind bars? A billionaire trapped in a system that doesn't care about fame, guards watching his every move, inmates testing him, waiting for his first mistake. No VIP treatment, no private jets, no bodyguards, just cold steel bars, tasteless food, and a brutal reality setting in. How did one of the biggest names in the music industry go from private yachts to a prison jumpsuit? And will he survive the dangerous world inside MDC Brooklyn? This is the shocking truth about Diddy's first 24 hours in prison. Watch now before it's too late. Upon his arrest, Sean "Diddy" Combs was immediately processed and transported to the Metropolitan Detention Center, MDC, in Brooklyn, New York, a federal detention facility that houses inmates awaiting trial or sentencing. Unlike traditional prisons, MDC is known for its high security measures, strict routines, and minimal privileges, making it a stark contrast to the luxurious lifestyle the music mogul was accustomed to. Upon arrival, Diddy underwent the standard intake procedure, which included an initial health screening, fingerprinting, and documentation. This process ensured that he was registered within the federal prison system and assessed for any immediate medical or psychological concerns. As part of protocol, he was also strip searched to prevent any contraband from entering the facility. The first step in his transition from a free man to an inmate was the confiscation of all personal belongings. Any jewelry, designer clothing, electronic devices, and personal effects were taken away, replaced by a standard-issue prison uniform consisting of a khaki jumpsuit, basic undergarments, and slip-on shoes. His legal documents and some money for commissary use were the only items he could retain. Due to his high-profile status and the severity of the charges against him, authorities took extra precautions, placing him under temporary administrative segregation, a form of solitary confinement for inmates at risk of harm or those requiring additional monitoring. This meant that, in his first 24 hours, he was isolated in a small, sparsely furnished cell, typically measuring 6 by 8 feet, with only a thin mattress on a metal bed frame, a toilet, and a small sink. Security at MDC is known to be rigid and unforgiving. Inmates are constantly monitored by cameras and correctional officers, ensuring that there are no unauthorized movements. Diddy was likely aware that his every action was being watched, as MDC has been known for incidents of inmate violence, power struggles, and harsh living conditions. Despite being a multimillionaire and a cultural icon, inside MDC, he was simply another inmate, referred to only by his assigned federal identification number. Any special treatment he might have expected in the outside world was no longer a factor within the walls of the detention center. The abrupt loss of control over his own life was likely a harsh psychological shock, forcing him to quickly adjust to his new, restrictive reality. His first official conversation within MDC was not with his legal team, but with prison staff, who would have explained the basic rules he needed to follow: strict meal schedules and limited recreation time, rules on when and how to speak to guards and fellow inmates, expectations regarding cell cleanliness and behavior, the penalties for disobedience or misconduct, which could include time in the Special Housing Unit, SHU, also known as solitary confinement. By the time the initial processing was complete, it was likely late at night or early morning, leaving Diddy mentally and physically exhausted. He was given a thin blanket and a small hygiene kit before being led to his holding cell. The first few hours in detention can be some of the most mentally challenging, as inmates experience fear, regret, and the overwhelming realization that their lives have drastically changed. For Diddy, a man who once had complete freedom, wealth, and status, the sudden transition into a cold, enclosed cell with no entourage, no assistance, and no luxury must have been a brutal awakening. After being fully processed and officially placed under federal custody, Diddy faced the stark reality of life inside the Metropolitan Detention Center, MDC, in Brooklyn. Known for its harsh conditions, overcrowding, and strict security measures, the facility houses not only white-collar criminals, but also violent offenders, gang members, and individuals awaiting trial on serious federal charges. Despite being a high-profile celebrity, his status meant nothing inside MDC. He was now subject to the same rigid conditions as every other inmate, forced to adapt quickly to an environment designed to break even the strongest individuals. Cell conditions and daily restrictions. Diddy's first full day inside MDC was spent in administrative segregation, a protective measure meant to keep him isolated from the general prison population. This form of solitary confinement, while offering some safety, came with its own psychological challenges. His cell was a small, windowless space with bare concrete walls, a metal bed frame bolted to the ground, and a thin mattress that provided little comfort. The room contained a basic stainless steel toilet and sink combination with no privacy, just a constant reminder of the institutional control over every aspect of his life. There was no television, no music, and no outside communication beyond legally permitted calls and supervised attorney visits. The lights in MDC cells are known to be kept on nearly 24/7, making sleep difficult for inmates. Temperature control is also notoriously poor, meaning cells can be freezing in winter and stiflingly hot in summer. Given that MDC has been under scrutiny for inhumane conditions, Diddy likely experienced the immediate discomfort that many inmates have reported. The lack of fresh air, the persistent smell of institutional disinfectant mixed with sweat, and the unsettling feeling of being trapped in a place where no one cares who you are or what you've achieved. Overcrowding an inmate population. The general population areas of MDC are extremely overcrowded, and while Diddy was kept in segregation for the time being, he was fully aware that he could eventually be moved into shared spaces with dozens of other inmates. MDC has been criticized for its overfilled units, where multiple prisoners are crammed into small spaces designed for far fewer occupants. The facility houses a mix of low, medium, and high-risk inmates, including members of organized crime, drug cartels, and violent street gangs. The racial and territorial divisions inside the prison are well defined, with inmates often forced to align with a group for their own protection. If and when Diddy is transferred into general population, he may have to navigate these dangerous social dynamics carefully. Limited privileges and psychological pressure. One of the hardest adjustments for any new inmate, especially someone accustomed to luxury, is the loss of control over even the smallest aspects of life. For Diddy, this meant adhering to MDC's rigid routine, limited shower access, typically 3 times a week depending on restrictions, minimal recreation time in a small enclosed yard under heavy supervision, no direct access to personal belongings or outside entertainment, restricted communication, with phone calls only permitted at specific times and constantly monitored. Strict mealtime regulations with food that is often cold, bland, and nutritionally inadequate. Diddy, like all inmates, was expected to follow these rules without question. Any sign of defiance or refusal to comply could result in punitive measures, including solitary confinement, loss of visitation rights, or even physical restraint. The psychological toll of incarceration. For a man who spent decades building an empire in music, fashion, and business, the reality of being completely powerless within the prison system was likely one of the most jarring aspects of his first 24 hours. The emotional impact of being incarcerated in such a hostile environment cannot be underestimated. Many inmates, especially those who are unaccustomed to prison life, experience extreme anxiety and paranoia, particularly regarding potential threats from other prisoners. Insomnia and depression, exacerbated by the cold, sterile conditions and isolation. A rapid shift in mindset, from being a public figure to becoming an inmate, stripped of identity and status. Given his notoriety and ongoing legal battle, it is likely that he was under constant surveillance, not just by guards, but by other inmates eager to test his resilience. In federal detention centers, new arrivals, especially those with wealth or fame, are often seen as easy targets. In his first full day at MDC, Diddy had to quickly adjust to the unrelenting monotony of prison life, understanding that every action, every conversation, and every movement was now dictated by a system designed to break him down. By the time Diddy reached his first full day in 1650 Brooklyn, he had already endured the psychological and physical shock of incarceration. However, the real challenge was just beginning. The monotonous, highly controlled daily routine that defines life inside the detention center. Every aspect of his existence was now dictated by strict schedules and institutional rules, leaving no room for personal preferences, freedom, or luxury. Prison meals, a harsh reality. One of the most immediate and jarring adjustments for any new inmate is the food. For Diddy, who was used to private chefs, five-star restaurants, and a carefully curated diet, the sudden shift to prison meals was likely one of the hardest shocks to his system. MDC follows the Federal Bureau of Prisons meal regulations, which means food is designed to meet the minimum nutritional standards rather than provide taste or variety. Meals are bland, often cold, and lack the quality of even the most basic restaurant dishes. What Diddy ate on his first day in prison. Breakfast, 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. Cold cereal or oatmeal with no sugar, one slice of bread with margarine, a small portion of powdered eggs or processed meat, a cup of milk, often room temperature. Lunch, 10:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. A main course, which could be chicken patty, pasta, or fish. Overcooked vegetables with no seasoning, a side of white rice or instant mashed potatoes, a small carton of juice or powdered drink mix. Dinner, 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Something similar to lunch, often reheated leftovers. A single fruit, usually an apple or orange. A slice of bread with peanut butter or cheese. For inmates in administrative segregation, like Diddy, meals are not served in a cafeteria, but are instead delivered directly to their cells. This means no interaction with other prisoners during mealtime, adding to the psychological isolation. Strict daily routine and limited movement. The first 24 hours in MDC also introduced Diddy to the rigid structure of prison life, where every moment is accounted for. Unlike the fast-paced, high-energy lifestyle he once had, prison routines are slow, repetitive, and mentally exhausting. 5 a.m., wake-up call, lights on, guards begin rounds. 5:30 a.m. to 6 a.m., breakfast served. 6:30 a.m. to 10 a.m., in-cell confinement, no movement unless for court appearances or medical checks. 10:30 a.m. to 11:30 a.m., lunch. 12 p.m. to 3:30 p.m., limited activities. This could include legal visits, reading, or sitting in a common area if allowed. 4 p.m. to 5 p.m., dinner. 5:30 p.m. to 8 p.m., lock-in time, where most inmates remain inside their cells. 9 p.m. to 10 p.m., final head count before lights out. For an inmate in isolation or under administrative segregation, the majority of this time is spent in their cell with minimal human interaction. If granted recreation time, it would typically last 1 hour per day, where he could walk in a small, fenced yard or exercise in a restricted indoor space. No more luxury, only institutional control. For someone like Diddy, who built a career based on being in control, making his own schedule, and living lavishly, this transition to a world where he had no say in anything was undoubtedly one of the most difficult aspects of his incarceration. No custom meal orders, he had to eat whatever was served or go hungry. No sleeping in, lights and head counts were non-negotiable. No spontaneous calls or texts, he had to wait for designated phone times and calls were monitored. No privacy, guards could check his cell at any time. At MDC Brooklyn, personal freedom is non-existent, and for someone accustomed to first-class travel, luxury homes, and absolute control over his environment, the sudden reality of being just another inmate in an overcrowded, understaffed federal facility was likely a crushing realization. By the time Diddy completed his first full 24 hours inside MDC Brooklyn, he had already faced the psychological shock of incarceration, the harsh realities of prison meals, and the strict daily routine. However, one of the most crucial aspects of surviving in prison, especially for a high-profile inmate like him, was understanding the security measures and the unspoken rules of inmate interactions. High security measures and isolation. Because of his celebrity status, pending criminal charges, and potential threats from other inmates, Diddy was placed under administrative segregation, ADSEG. which is essentially a more restrictive form of solitary confinement. The Metropolitan Detention Center (MDC) is known for its tight security, housing inmates from white-collar criminals to violent offenders. However, over the years, MDC has faced criticism for its lack of transparency, prisoner mistreatment, and internal corruption. Key security measures. Diddy faced constant surveillance. Every movement he made inside his cell and the facility was monitored by security cameras and correctional officers, COs. Any suspicious behavior or defiance could result in further punishment. Limited contact with other inmates. To minimize risks, high-profile inmates are often kept away from the general prison population. This meant no free socialization, reducing the chances of conflicts, but also increasing isolation and mental strain. Strict escort rules. Whenever he needed to be moved, whether for legal meetings, medical checkups, or recreation, he was likely handcuffed, sometimes even shackled at the feet, and escorted by multiple guards. Frequent cell checks. Guards performed random searches of his cell to ensure he wasn't hiding anything illegal, such as contraband, unauthorized notes, or makeshift weapons. Despite these restrictions, being in prison means being surrounded by criminals, and reputation matters. If an inmate appears weak, lost, or isolated, they become an easy target. Even in protective custody, interactions with guards and other prisoners could determine how difficult or manageable his prison experience would be. The power dynamics of prison. First encounters with other inmates. Regardless of his status outside prison, inside MDC, Diddy was just another inmate, and that meant adjusting to the unwritten rules of prison culture. Even though his placement in ADSEG limited his exposure, he would eventually cross paths with other prisoners, whether during transport, recreation, or meal distribution. These moments would be critical in establishing how he would be perceived. What happens when a high-profile inmate arrives? Testing phase. Many inmates immediately judge a newcomer, especially a celebrity, to see if he's soft, scared, or holding himself above others. Gang affiliations. Although MDC Brooklyn is notorious for housing gang members, Diddy's status would make him valuable to certain groups. Some inmates might try to recruit him for protection, while others might resent his wealth and fame. Respect is everything. If he acted too arrogant or disconnected, some inmates would see him as weak. If he engaged too much, he risked being manipulated or extorted. The key was finding balance, staying out of conflicts while showing he wasn't afraid. Possible first interactions in MDC Brooklyn. Observing from a distance. In his first recreation period, he might have noticed who controls the yard, which inmates avoid each other, and who commands respect. Even in isolation, understanding the hierarchy of the facility is essential for survival. Casual conversation with guards. While guards are generally indifferent, some might treat him differently due to his fame, either with extra hostility or a slight favoritism. However, inmates who seem too friendly with guards are labeled snitches, which could put him in danger. First words with another inmate. The moment another inmate acknowledges him, his response could dictate his reputation. A firm, neutral demeanor is key. He couldn't afford to appear too friendly or too dismissive. The unspoken prison rules. He had to learn fast. Unlike the outside world, where his money and influence dictated power, prison operates under an entirely different set of rules. Diddy would need to adapt quickly to the social structure, which includes never asking too many questions. Curiosity is viewed as suspicious behavior in prison. Never borrowing or owing favors. Even something as small as a pack of ramen or a snack can lead to owing someone a favor later. Keeping eye contact minimal but firm. Avoiding eye contact can make him look weak, but staring too long can be seen as disrespectful or confrontational. Knowing when to talk and when to stay silent, speaking at the wrong time, especially during tense situations, can make an inmate a target. Understanding that prison justice is different, there are unofficial rules enforced by inmates. Violating them could be more dangerous than breaking facility policies. The psychological challenge, power shift and vulnerability. For someone who spent his entire life at the top, being in prison meant a complete reversal of power. He no longer controlled his environment, his schedule, or even his personal interactions. Even if he had lawyers fighting his case inside MDC, he was just another inmate navigating the dangerous world of prison politics. His first encounters with other prisoners would determine whether his time in custody would be tolerable or a living nightmare. By the time Diddy completed his first 24 hours inside MDC Brooklyn, the mental and emotional weight of incarceration had already begun to set in. While the physical conditions, loss of control, and inmate hierarchy were immediate challenges, the psychological toll of being locked away, isolated, and stripped of his status was perhaps the most profound. For someone who had spent decades at the top of the entertainment industry, accustomed to power, wealth, and influence, the sudden transition to a confined, restricted, and dehumanizing environment was a severe shock to his system. The psychological stages of incarceration. Psychologists who study the effects of incarceration often outline distinct mental stages that new inmates go through. Diddy, like many first-time high-profile prisoners, likely experienced some of these emotional responses almost immediately. Shock and denial, first 24 to 48 hours. The initial disbelief of being locked away in a small cell under strict surveillance, a sense of detachment, as if the situation were surreal, almost like a bad dream. Attempting to mentally resist the reality, thinking, "This is temporary, I'll be out soon." Anxiety and panic, first few days to weeks. Realizing that no amount of money or influence could immediately change his situation. Fear of physical harm from other inmates or mistreatment from guards. Feeling vulnerable and powerless, something he had never truly experienced before. Depression and hopelessness, weeks to months. The monotony of prison life starts to feel crushing. Loss of identity. He is no longer a celebrity, but just another inmate, questioning his future, his reputation, and whether he'll ever recover from this downfall. Adaptation or breakdown, months and beyond. Some inmates mentally adjust, learning to survive within the system. Others break down completely, experiencing paranoia, withdrawal, or even suicidal thoughts. Signs of psychological breakdown in the first 24 hours. Diddy's first full day in MDC was likely the most mentally grueling period he had ever endured. The following psychological stressors may have already begun to affect him. 1. Sensory deprivation and sleep deprivation. Solitary confinement or administrative segregation means extreme isolation. No sounds of the outside world, no normal human interactions. MDC is known for keeping lights on inside cells almost 24/7, making it difficult for inmates to sleep. The constant noise of distant shouting, metal doors slamming, and guards making rounds disrupts any attempt at rest. Sleep deprivation alone can trigger hallucinations, paranoia, and heightened anxiety. 2. Panic attacks and loss of appetite. Many first-time inmates experience severe anxiety, sometimes leading to panic attacks, shortness of breath, and racing thoughts. The prison diet, which is bland, unfamiliar, and lacks nutrition, often causes loss of appetite, which can worsen fatigue and mental exhaustion. Diddy, used to luxury dining and personal chefs, now faced cold, processed prison food that was barely edible. 3. The crushing loneliness of isolation. Being in administrative segregation meant he had little to no human interaction, except for brief moments when guards delivered meals or performed cell checks. While this isolation protected him from immediate harm, it accelerated the mental deterioration that many inmates face. The absence of conversations, familiar voices, and any sense of normalcy would have created a deep sense of loneliness and emotional instability. 4. Paranoia and fear of the unknown. Even if no inmates had directly threatened him yet, the knowledge that MDC houses dangerous individuals would have fueled his fear and paranoia. Prison violence is often unpredictable. Fights and attacks can erupt without warning, making every moment feel like walking on thin ice. He may have already begun questioning who he could trust, whether guards were truly neutral, and if someone was planning to target him. The emotional collapse of a man used to power. One of the most mentally crushing aspects of Diddy's incarceration was likely the complete loss of power and influence. For decades, he was the one in control. He dictated business deals, surrounded himself with a team that catered to his every need, and had access to endless resources. Now he couldn't even control when he ate, showered, or spoke to another human being. No phone calls at will, only when permitted by the prison. No personal security team. His only protection was the prison system that viewed him as just another case number. No media interviews to shape the narrative. He was now at the mercy of court decisions, legal proceedings, and public speculation. This realization, more than anything, may have been the breaking point for his first signs of emotional collapse. The suicide watch factor. It's not uncommon for high-profile inmates to be placed under suicide watch upon entering federal detention centers. Given the sudden mental trauma, overwhelming anxiety, and deep shame that comes with incarceration, authorities often monitor celebrities closely to prevent self-harm. If Diddy showed any signs of emotional distress, excessive silence, refusal to eat, or expressions of hopelessness, MDC officials may have placed him in a special observation cell where he would be watched 24/7. Restricted access to any items that could be used for self-harm, limited his movement even further, making his isolation even more severe. While there's no confirmed report of him being placed on suicide watch, his first 24 hours were likely filled with overwhelming psychological distress, self-doubt, and fear for the future. Can a man like Diddy mentally survive prison? Surviving the first few days of incarceration is often the hardest mental battle. Diddy is known for his confidence, resilience, and business acumen, but none of that guarantees survival in a federal detention center. If he mentally crumbled too quickly, it would make him vulnerable to both guards and inmates who exploit weakness. If he adapted too aggressively, trying to be overly tough, it could provoke retaliation from hardened inmates who see through the act. The longer he stays inside, the more his mind will have to shift from celebrity mode to survival mode, the ultimate psychological challenge. The first breakdown often sets the tone for how an inmate navigates the rest of their prison sentence. For Diddy, this was just the beginning of his mental transformation inside one of the toughest federal detention centers in the country. By the time Diddy had survived his first 24 to 48 hours inside MDC Brooklyn, he had already faced the psychological torment of isolation, the shock of losing all personal freedom, and the crushing realization that his life had changed forever. However, his biggest test was still to come, the first confrontation with other inmates. No matter how famous, wealthy, or respected an individual is in the outside world, inside prison, respect is earned differently. The unwritten rule is simple. If an inmate looks weak, he becomes a target. The welcome test for high-profile inmates. In almost every prison, newcomers, especially celebrities, politicians, or wealthy individuals, are subjected to an initial test. Other inmates want to see if he can handle himself or if he'll fold under pressure, if he'll try to act superior because of his wealth and status, if he's willing to fight back or if he'll rely on guards for protection, if he can be manipulated, extorted, or used for favors. Diddy, being a world-famous music mogul, was a prime target for these tests. Even in administrative segregation, there are always opportunities for verbal or physical altercations, whether during meal deliveries, recreation time, or even brief hallway interactions. The first confrontation, verbal or physical. While it's unclear exactly when or how Diddy's first altercation happened, it's almost guaranteed that within his first few days, another inmate tested him. Scenario 1, the verbal check. A common way to test a new inmate's mental toughness is through insults, intimidation, or verbal threats. It's likely that at some point during his first days in MDC, an inmate attempted to provoke him with one of the following. Mocking his fame. "Yo, Puffy, where your bodyguards at now? Ain't no VIP section in here, huh?" disrespecting his legal case. You think you're gonna buy your way out of this one? They got you good, huh? You ain't above the law in here. Pushing for a reaction. You looking real soft, man. How you gonna survive in here? I bet you don't last a month. For inmates, a celebrity's reaction to these comments determines how they'll be treated moving forward. If Diddy ignored it completely, he might be seen as scared or weak. If he responded too aggressively, he might provoke a physical fight. If he kept his composure but responded firmly, he could maintain some level of respect. It's likely that, given his decades of experience in the rap industry, Diddy knew how to keep his ego in check. But even then, prison dynamics are completely different from the entertainment world. Scenario 2, the physical test. If verbal intimidation didn't work, a physical test might have followed. This could have happened in several ways. An inmate accidentally bumping into him in a hallway or during meal distribution. Someone throwing food or an object in his direction to see how he'd react. A more direct approach. Getting in his face, testing his personal space. In prison, fights don't always happen over major issues. Sometimes they start over the smallest perceived disrespect. If Diddy reacted emotionally, he could have been dragged into an immediate altercation. The risk of retaliation and gangs taking interest. While Diddy wasn't a known gang member, the reality of prison life is that gangs control much of the environment. The longer he stayed in MDC, the more pressure he would face to pick a side or align with a group. If he tried to stay neutral, that could be seen as weakness, making him an even bigger target. If he associated with a particular group, that could bring protection, but also obligations he might not want. If he tried to keep his distance from everyone, inmates might see that as arrogance, and he'd become a target for extortion or violence. Did the guards step in? MDC Brooklyn has a history of corruption and abuse, with guards sometimes turning a blind eye to inmate violence. If an altercation occurred, the guards might have stepped in quickly, separating the inmates. If Diddy showed signs of distress, he could have been placed in further isolation, which might damage his mental state even more. If no serious injuries occurred, the guards may have ignored the situation, letting the inmates sort it out themselves. How this first test shapes his survival strategy. Every new inmate remembers their first confrontation, whether it's verbal or physical. It determines how they are treated for the rest of their time in custody. For Diddy, this moment was critical. It forced him to decide whether to keep a low profile or stand his ground, adapt to the prison's social hierarchy and avoid becoming a target, understand that fame no longer protects him, only his actions inside 1650 matter now. If he handled the confrontation well, he might be left alone for a while. If he showed weakness, his life in 1600 could become even more difficult, with inmates constantly pushing his limits. Was this just the beginning? The first altercation is rarely the last. If Diddy stayed in MDC long enough, he would eventually face another confrontation, likely bigger than the first. Be forced to respond to further intimidation or manipulation. Decide if he needed to align with a group to survive. This was only the beginning of his transformation from music mogul to federal inmate, and every move he made would determine whether he became an easy target or learned how to survive behind bars. By now, Diddy had spent several days inside MDC Brooklyn, adapting to the harsh conditions, strict routines, and constant psychological pressure. However, one of the most dangerous moments for any inmate is yard time, the brief period when prisoners are allowed outside to get fresh air, exercise, and interact. For many inmates, the yard is the only escape from the claustrophobic cells. But for others, it's a war zone, a place where gangs settle disputes, enemies confront each other, and alliances are formed or broken. For Diddy, his first trip to the yard was not just about getting sunlight, it was a test of survival. The structure of the yard at MDC Brooklyn. Unlike in maximum security prisons, where large open yards exist, MDC Brooklyn's yard is much smaller and more confined. The yard is a fenced-in rooftop area, enclosed by thick concrete walls and metal grates. Surveillance cameras monitor every movement, But guards are not always quick to intervene in fights or altercations. There is little space to move freely, meaning every inmate is in close proximity to others, making confrontations almost unavoidable. Who controls the yard? Like most prisons, the yard is divided along racial and gang lines. Even for an inmate in administrative segregation, the day would come when he'd have to step into this environment and face the reality of how power and hierarchy work behind bars. Gangs and racial groups control different areas. Unwritten rules exist. Certain benches, workout equipment, and spaces belong to specific groups. A high-profile newcomer like Diddy would immediately attract attention. As a wealthy, influential black celebrity, some inmates might expect him to align with a group for protection. If he didn't, he could be seen as arrogant or vulnerable. The first time in the yard, what likely happened? Scenario 1, being watched and judged. The moment Diddy entered the yard, he immediately felt dozens of eyes on him. Every inmate in the space would be assessing him, his demeanor, his body language, and whether he looked scared or confident. Some common reactions from other prisoners might have been silent stares, inmates observing how he carried himself, whispers and laughter, some mocking him, others discussing whether he was worth extorting, a few inmates approaching to either test him, intimidate him, or recruit him. Scenario 2, first direct confrontation in the yard. The yard is where many first fights or initiations happen. If another inmate saw him as weak, he might have been singled out quickly, someone bumping into him on purpose, testing if he'd react. A group of inmates surrounding him, asking questions like, "You think you special out here? You rolling with anybody yet?" A gang-affiliated inmate warning him that he'd need to choose a side soon. For most new inmates, the first yard experience determines whether they'll be respected or targeted. Diddy's options in the yard. In this environment, Diddy had limited choices: stay alone and keep a low profile. Avoid talking too much, focus on exercising, and not engage with the wrong people. Downside: being isolated makes an inmate more of a target for future problems. Align with a group for protection. Prison politics often force inmates to pick a side based on race, status, or mutual connections. Downside: this comes with obligations. He'd owe loyalty, and refusal could mean consequences. Act tough and show no fear. Trying to act dominant in the yard could earn respect, but also provoke challenges from those wanting to test him. Downside: if he couldn't back it up, he'd lose even more respect. Did he witness violence? Violence in the yard is common in MDC Brooklyn. Even if Diddy wasn't directly involved, his first day outside might have exposed him to fights, intimidation, or even stabbings. A sudden fight breaking out between gang members, a guard shouting, "Lock it down!" and rushing in to break up an altercation, an inmate being taken away after getting attacked. This would be a harsh wake-up call, showing him that at any moment, things can turn deadly inside MDC. Leaving the yard, another psychological test. After his first hour outside, Diddy would have returned to his cold, isolated cell, processing everything he had just witnessed. Had he gained or lost respect? Did he make enemies or potential allies? Would tomorrow in the yard be worse? For many inmates, yard time is the most stressful part of the day, the one place where guards have less control and anything can happen. For Diddy, this experience would reshape his perception of what survival truly meant inside MDC. By now, Diddy had spent several days inside MDC Brooklyn, enduring the shock of incarceration, psychological pressure, confrontation with inmates, and the brutal reality of prison life. But there was one more realization that would set in, a realization that every first-time inmate eventually faces: there is no easy way out. Understanding this system, the harsh reality of federal detention. The biggest misconception about celebrity inmates is that they receive special treatment or can simply buy their way out of trouble. However, once inside the federal system, Diddy was no longer a powerful businessman. He was an inmate subject to the same bureaucracy, delays, and legal obstacles as everyone else. Even with a top-tier legal team, There was no instant exit from MDC Brooklyn. The federal judicial process moves slowly, and pretrial detention can last months or even years before a final verdict is reached. What this meant for Diddy, bail was not guaranteed. Federal cases, especially serious ones, rarely allow for quick bail release. If denied, he could be locked up indefinitely until trial. Court dates are spread out. Unlike state cases, federal court proceedings take weeks or months between hearings, meaning every day inside MDC would feel like an eternity. No celebrity privileges. Inside prison, the system doesn't care about status or fame. Everyone is treated by their case number, not their reputation. For someone who had spent decades controlling his destiny, making deals and shaping public narratives, this loss of power was crushing. Mental collapse, facing the weight of reality. Many first-time inmates suffer their worst emotional breakdown once they fully grasp that their situation isn't temporary. Signs that Diddy might have reached his breaking point. Extreme silence. Some inmates go into deep withdrawal, refusing to talk to anyone as they process their downfall. Loss of appetite. He was no longer just adjusting to bad prison food. He might have started skipping meals out of stress and hopelessness. Irritability and outbursts. Prisoners who once had complete control over their lives sometimes snap at guards or other inmates, frustrated by their helplessness. Sleeping too much or too little. Depression in prison often manifests in insomnia or excessive sleeping, both signs of emotional exhaustion. The why me moment, accepting the fall from grace. Many high-profile inmates struggle with one fundamental thought. How did this happen to me? Diddy had built a billion-dollar empire, surrounded by wealth, influence, and the finest luxuries the world could offer. Now he was locked in a cell, wearing a standard prison uniform, stripped of everything that once defined his life. At this point, he was likely grappling with three internal battles: his past decisions, questioning whether he trusted the wrong people, took the wrong risks, or ignored warning signs that led to his downfall. His public image, wondering how the world was viewing him now, from music mogul to incarcerated defendant. His future, fearing what comes next. Will he ever walk free again? Or is this the beginning of the end? This phase of self-reflection is dangerous, as many inmates who reach this point either mentally shut down or become desperate to escape their reality, by any means necessary. The final realization: no one can save him now. For the first time in his life, Diddy was truly alone. His legal team could fight for him in court, but they couldn't change his daily reality in 1600. His wealth was useless in a place where money couldn't buy freedom, comfort, or security. His connections in the music industry, fashion world, and elite social circles meant nothing behind bars. He had to survive on his own. For some inmates, this realization breaks them completely, leading to depression, paranoia, and even thoughts of self-harm. For others, it awakens a survival instinct, forcing them to adapt, strategize, and figure out how to make it through their sentence. What comes next? Survival or despair? Diddy now faced a crucial turning point. He could either mentally adapt to his new environment, learning the prison system and navigating its dangers, struggle against reality, resisting every aspect of incarceration, and making his time inside even harder. Lose himself completely, breaking down under the pressure, with no sense of hope. Whichever path he chose, one thing was clear: the world he once knew was gone, and his journey inside MDC Brooklyn was just beginning.